I saw him, the HOA president, hammering the final plank onto my lake. My lake. Right there under the sun, while neighbors watched in awkward silence. Each strike of the hammer felt like a punch to my chest. He didn't just trespass, he was claiming my property, acting like this dock belonged to him. "What are you doing?" I shouted. But he smirked, brushing me off. "Improving the community," he said, as if that excused stealing from me. What he didn't know was I wasn't helpless. I had the 1847 water rights deed tucked safely at home, a piece of paper that made every inch of that lake legally mine. Every board he nailed down, every laugh he threw at me, was just leading him to his own downfall. I'm not just a landowner, I fight for property rights. And today, patience was my weapon. By the time this dock was finished, the shock would be complete, and he would realize he'd built his own undoing. The fog still clung to the lake when I stepped down onto the wet grass that morning, curling low over the water like smoke from something just. Birds burst out of the cattails at my approach, wings snapping the quiet, while somewhere across the shoreline a hammer echoed, slow, steady, deliberate, wood on wood, fresh boards. The sound rolled over the water and settled in my chest. I stood there longer than I meant to, boots soaking through, watching ripples spread across a surface I knew better than my own driveway. I didn't inherit this place by accident. I bought it after years of grinding work, after walking away from safer options and sinking everything into land most people thought was more trouble than it was worth. I rebuilt the shoreline myself, reinforced erosion walls, replanted native reeds, filed permits, hired surveyors, argued with contractors who tried to cut corners. Every foot of that waterline had cost me time, money, and sleep. So hearing construction on it without a single call, notice, or discussion felt unreal. At first it was disbelief, the kind that makes you blink hard and look again, wondering if you're misunderstanding what you're seeing. Then it tightened into something colder, controlled, focused. Anger that doesn't explode, it calculates. I've spent years dealing with zoning boards, wetland buffers, runoff rules, shoreline setbacks. I know how environmental compliance works. I know what HOAs can regulate, and more importantly, what they absolutely cannot. I've sat through hearings in rooms that smelled like old carpet and burnt coffee, flipping through binders thicker than phone books. I've scrolled microfilm until my eyes hurt, traced property lines on maps older than the county seal printed on them, which is why that hammer kept echoing in my head. This wasn't sudden. The tension hadn't started that morning. For months, letters had shown up in my mailbox. Courtesy notices, community concerns, survey flags near my trees. Rumors passed through neighbors who suddenly stopped waving. As the fog thinned and the sun burned through, I stared across the water and listened to the boards creak into place. Whatever the HOA thought they were building out there, this had been coming for a long time. When I first saw the lake, it didn't look like something out of a brochure. The shoreline was chewed up by erosion, reeds flattened into muddy tangles, old fence posts leaned at odd angles where storms had pulled soil away. The water itself was beautiful, deep, reflective, alive with fish, but everything around it looked tired, neglected, forgotten. Most buyers drove past it. I didn't. I saw potential the way you see a half-finished house, through the mess, through the rot, straight to what it could become if someone cared enough to fight for it. That was years ago. I drained my savings to buy the land. Took out loans that made my stomach twist every time I logged into my bank account. Friends told me I was reckless. Realtors warned me about wetland restrictions and environmental oversight. One even laughed and said, "You're basically buying paperwork with a view." They weren't wrong about the paperwork. Before I touched a shovel, I had to file erosion mitigation plans, shoreline stabilization proposals, wildlife impact assessments. I learned terms I never thought would matter to me: riparian buffers, silt fencing, stormwater runoff coefficients. I hired biologists to survey nesting sites, engineers to design retaining walls that wouldn't choke the lake with sediment. Weekends disappeared into hauling stone, planting native grasses, installing core logs along the bank to slow wave damage. I waded into freezing water in early spring, pounding stakes for barriers while mist soaked my jacket and numb fingers refused to cooperate. But slowly, painfully, the land healed. Dragonflies came back first, then herons, bass started surfacing near the reeds again. The shoreline stopped collapsing after heavy rain. The water cleared. Eventually I built 2 small rental cabins tucked back into the trees. Not flashy, not luxury, just quiet places for people who wanted to fish at dawn and drink coffee, watching fog roll off the lake. Those cabins paid my mortgage. They funded the conservation work. They kept the property afloat. Emotionally though, The lake was everything. It was where I walked when life felt too loud, where I brought close friends who needed silence more than conversation, where I learned the pattern of storms by watching clouds fold over water instead of checking a forecast. Losing access to that shoreline, losing control over who built on it, who used it, who altered it, would have wrecked more than my finances. It would have gutted the reason I stayed. That's what made the idea of someone else planting pilings into my water feel like someone carving initials into my front door. Only worse. The HOA president's name was Mark Caldwell. People like him always arrive polished. Pressed golf polos even on weekdays. Khakis without a wrinkle. Sunglasses so reflective you could see your own irritation bouncing back at you when he talked. Hair trimmed every 10 days like it was part of his identity. He shook hands too firmly, held eye contact too long, smiled without warmth. He'd moved into the neighborhood about 3 years after I bought the property, into one of the newer homes on the far side of the development, stone facade, circular driveway, oversized garage doors, that made the house feel more like a corporate office than a place anyone actually lived. Within 6 months he was on the HOA board. Within a year he was running it. Mark loved meetings, loved agendas, loved microphones. Loved reminding people that he was just trying to keep standards high. He spoke in that booming practice tone that made it sound like he was addressing a ballroom, even when there were 12 folding chairs in the clubhouse and half of them were empty. Neighbors whispered about him in driveways, how he'd forced one family to repaint their siding because the shade of gray was outside community guideline, how he fined another for parking a work truck overnight, how an elderly couple got cited for leaving a canoe too close to their fence. Every story ended the same way. Mark always won. The first time we actually crossed paths was at a quarterly HOA meeting. I'd gone because I'd received a vague notice about shoreline considerations and wanted clarification. He was already standing at the front when I arrived, tapping a stack of papers against the podium. When my turn came to speak, I introduced myself, explained which parcel I owned, and asked politely what shoreline concerns meant for properties bordering the lake. Mark tilted his head like I'd asked something adorable. "Oh," he said, smiling. "You're the lake guy." I didn't love that. "We're exploring improvements," he went on, glancing around the room instead of at me. "Long-term community enhancements. Amenities. You know how it is." "I'd just like to know what that involves," I said. His smile tightened. "Well," he replied, "if everyone cooperates, it shouldn't be a problem." It wasn't an answer. After the meeting, I caught him near the coffee urn and asked again. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice in a way that felt rehearsed. "Look," he said, clapping a hand on my shoulder like we were friends. "That lake's a huge asset. You've been enjoying it solo for a long time. Sometimes things evolve." That was the first time my stomach dropped. It didn't take long for rumors to follow. The HOA wanted a dock, a shared access structure, something large enough for kayaks, paddleboards, maybe even pontoon boats down the line. The phrase community waterfront upgrade started popping up in newsletters. From their perspective, it made sense. Lakeviews sold houses. Amenities raised property values. A dock looked good in marketing photos. From mine, it was a nightmare. Shared access meant strangers near my shoreline. Increased foot traffic meant erosion. Liability concerns exploded. Someone slips, someone drowns. Suddenly lawyers start circling. Insurance premiums spike the second a recreational structure touches water. Environmental agencies scrutinize runoff, fuel storage, wake patterns, and that's assuming the dock didn't quietly creep outward year after year. Structures have a way of doing that. Mark, meanwhile, stood to gain everything. He'd pitched the idea hard, promised increased resale value, told people it would put the neighborhood on the map. He needed votes to cement his control of the board. And flashy projects were perfect leverage. Neighbors fractured almost immediately. Some were thrilled. "I've always wanted lake access," one told me at the mailbox. Others avoided the topic entirely. A few pulled me aside in low voices. "He's pushing this fast," one woman whispered. "I don't like how he's handling it," another admitted. "But I don't want trouble." That was the word everyone used. Trouble. Because Mark didn't argue, he pressured. He framed dissent as selfishness, resistance as obstruction. Anyone who questioned him suddenly found inspectors measuring fence heights or letters showing up about mailbox placements. And me, I wasn't just questioning him, I was standing between him and his signature project, which meant my shoreline wasn't just land anymore, it was a battlefield he hadn't officially declared yet. Not publicly, but every courtesy notice, every survey flag, every sideways look at meetings. They were warnings, and standing on the edge of that water, watching fog lift, while construction noises echoed across the lake, I finally understood something. This wasn't about improvement, it was about control. And Mark Caldwell had decided my lake was the easiest place to prove he had it. The first letter arrived in a thin white envelope, with the HOA logo stamped in the corner like a warning seal. Courtesy notice, it read in bold. My shoreline vegetation was allegedly overgrown. I was instructed to trim back reeds within 10 days or face escalating fines. I stood at my kitchen counter rereading it while coffee went cold beside me. Those reeds were native plantings, approved in writing by the County Conservation Office years earlier. They were there to stop erosion. Cutting them would undo thousands of dollars of mitigation work. I scanned the signature at the bottom, Mark Caldwell. 2 days later, another letter showed up. This one wasn't polite. Violation of environmental standards. Unapproved shoreline modification, potential runoff hazard. I laughed once, short and disbelieving, before the sound died in my throat. I hadn't modified anything. If anything, I'd done the opposite of what most landowners bothered to do. I'd stabilized banks, planted buffers, reduced sediment flow. I kept copies of every permit in a filing cabinet in my office, sorted by year, color-coded because that's what dealing with regulators trains you to become obsessive. Still, the timing was too perfect to ignore. Within a week, I noticed pink survey flags stabbed into the soil near my tree line. I hadn't put them there. I followed the little plastic ribbons down the slope until they stopped near the water's edge, fluttering in the breeze like markers on a battlefield. Later that afternoon, a white pickup truck with magnetic HOA logos idled at the end of my gravel access road while 2 men in neon vests unfolded tripods. I walked down and asked what they were doing. One of them didn't look up from his clipboard. Survey work. For what? He hesitated just long enough to tell me he hadn't been instructed to answer that. I called the HOA office. Voicemail. The next morning, a flatbed truck loaded with lumber blocked my driveway for nearly an hour while workers argued about directions. When I asked them to move, one shrugged. HOA said this was the staging area. I told them it absolutely wasn't. They exchanged looks and slowly rolled the truck forward, tires crunching gravel I'd paid to lay. By the end of the week, the newsletter hid in boxes across the neighborhood. Community update, shoreline access improvements. There was a paragraph about ongoing assessments and cooperative landowners. Unfortunately, certain property owners have resisted reasonable efforts to enhance shared amenities, forcing the board to explore enforcement measures to protect community interests. No names. Just one shoreline parcel that everyone knew about. Mine. Neighbors stopped me on walks. Some were awkward. Hey. Saw the email. Everything okay? Others weren't. Why are you blocking the dock? A man asked bluntly, while loading groceries into his trunk. I realized what Mark was doing. He wasn't confronting me directly, he was isolating me. Here's something most people don't understand until they're forced to. An HOA's power is not unlimited. Especially near water, HOAs govern what's written in their covenants. Paint colors, fence heights, landscaping styles, parking rules, shorelines? That's a different animal. Water-adjacent land usually falls under layers of regulation, county zoning, state environmental agencies, conservation districts, sometimes even federal oversight depending on wetlands or navigable waters. And ownership matters. There's a huge legal difference between an easement and title control. An easement means someone has limited permission to cross or use a strip of land for a specific purpose, like a utility company running a line or residents walking along a designated path. It does not mean they can build permanent structures. Title ownership is what gives you that power. HOAs love to blur that line. They talk about community access corridors, shared frontage, historical usage. It sounds official, but unless the documents explicitly grant construction rights, they're bluffing. I knew that, which made the escalation feel deliberate. The pressure kept building. A second crew showed up the following week without warning, this time drilling small test holes near the shoreline. When I confronted them, one muttered something about soil samples before packing up faster than people who know they shouldn't be somewhere. A certified letter arrived 2 days later threatening daily fines for non-compliant vegetation. I responded with copies of my permits. No reply. Instead, I got another newsletter. This one included a glossy mock-up rendering of a long wooden dock stretching into the lake, kayaks tied neatly at its sides, happy families photoshopped into sunset light. Underneath, coming soon, subject to final approval. Final approval from who? Because it sure wasn't me. I started documenting everything. Photos of trucks, dates of letters, screenshots of emails, flag locations. Time surveyors showed up unannounced. my phone filled with folders labeled by week. Neighbors began choosing sides without saying so. Some waved more cautiously, others stopped altogether, and Mark, he didn't contact me once. Not directly, not by email, not by phone, which told me everything. When someone wants to negotiate, they reach out. When someone wants to overpower you, they let the machine grind while pretending they're not touching the controls. Standing at my window one evening, watching the sun dip behind the trees while another pickup rolled slowly down my road and turned around, I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't misunderstanding. This was a campaign, and it had only just started. The neighborhood didn't turn on me all at once. It thinned. That was the first thing I noticed. People who used to linger by the mailbox cluster suddenly grabbed envelopes and walked back to their cars without looking up. Joggers crossed the street instead of passing my driveway. Conversations dipped when I stepped within earshot, like someone had twisted a volume knob the second my shadow touched the pavement. At first I told myself I was imagining it. Stress does that to you. It rewrites neutral expressions into accusations. But then I overheard my name. I was walking past the community board near the clubhouse when two men stopped mid-sentence. "Just don't see why he won't cooperate," one muttered. The other shrugged. "HOA says he's holding everything up." They didn't realize I was behind them until I shifted my weight. One of them glanced over his shoulder, gave a tight smile, and walked off without finishing the thought. That night, I sat in my truck for a full minute before going inside. Inside was worse. My partner tried not to sound worried, which somehow made it louder. "They left another message today," she said, setting her phone down on the kitchen counter like it was something sharp. "Your insurance agent, about liability exposure if the shoreline changes." I didn't answer right away. I was still thinking about the phrase holding everything up. "They think I'm being unreasonable," I finally said. She nodded slowly. "I think they think the HOA is what it's doing." We both knew what that meant. HOAs come with lawyers, retainers, committees, budgets padded with everyone else's dues. I had me, and whatever savings I hadn't already poured into erosion barriers and native plants. Later that evening, we spread paperwork across the dining table. Deeds, permits, insurance policies, old inspection reports. Legal language is its own kind of exhaustion. By midnight, my eyes burned. "How much would it cost," she asked quietly, "if this turns into a real fight?" I didn't like that I already had a number in my head. "I don't know," I said, which was true, but not honest, because I'd been doing the math in my head since the first certified letter arrived. Attorney consultations, surveyors, environmental consultants, filing fees, and that was before court. The lake had taken years to build into something stable. It could take months to bankrupt me. Sleep stopped coming easy after that. The nights were the worst. Sound travels across water in ways it doesn't over land. It skims the surface, carries farther, sharper, which meant that once the pile drivers started, there was no escaping them. Thump, pause, thump. Each strike echoed off the far tree line and came back doubled, a hollow metallic pulse that rattled window panes and sank straight into my chest. I lay awake counting them like a metronome. 37, 48, 62. At 3 a.m, I gave up and went to the porch with a mug of coffee I didn't want, staring out at black water lit by distant work lights. Every thump felt like a clock ticking down something I couldn't see. Some nights I swore they were doing it on purpose, working late just to make a point. You don't get that kind of paranoia unless pressure has already hollowed you out. During the day I tried to act normal. I still walked the shoreline, still checked erosion barriers after storms, still waved at neighbors who didn't wave back. But inside, something had shifted. I caught myself rehearsing arguments in my head while brushing my teeth, running worst-case scenarios while tying my boots. What if they keep fining me? What if the HOA places a lien? What if the bank decides the dispute makes my property too risky? That's the thing about financial fear. It doesn't announce itself, it creeps. It shows up while you're paying for groceries, while you're deciding whether to fix something now or wait another month, while you're calculating how long your emergency fund would actually last if emergency turned into drawn-out legal war. One afternoon I ran into a neighbor I'd always been friendly with, a woman who walked her golden retriever past my gate every evening. She slowed when she saw me. "Hey," I said. She hesitated, leash tightening in her hand. "Oh, hi." I smiled, waited. She glanced toward the lake, then back at me. "Listen, I'm sure you have your reasons," she said carefully. "But people are excited about the dock." There it was. "I'm not trying to ruin anything," I replied. She nodded, but her eyes flicked away. "Yeah, I just hope it works out." She left before I could say anything else. I stood there longer than necessary watching her disappear around the bend. That was the loneliest part. Not the letters, not the noise, not even the money. It was realizing how fast a story spreads when you're not the one telling it. Mark was shaping the narrative while I lay awake listening to construction equipment chew into water I'd spent years protecting. He had committees. I had insomnia. And every night, as those pile drivers echoed across the lake, the same thought kept looping in my head. If this turns into a full-scale legal fight, I might not have enough runway to survive it, which I realized was probably exactly what he was counting on. The next morning, I drove to the county records office before the sun had fully risen. The streets were quiet, fog still clinging to the pavement, and the lake already replayed in my mind, hammer strikes echoing across the water, neighbors whispering, Mark's smug grin stuck in my head. I needed answers, and the courthouse was the only place that could give them. Inside, the smell hit first: dust, old paper, faint mildew, and a hint of coffee from the vending machine. Long rows of metal cabinets stretched toward the ceiling, each drawer labeled with years, plot numbers, surveyors' names. I ran my fingers along the cool handles, feeling the grooves of age and use. I pulled drawer after drawer: maps, deeds, plats, some handwritten, some printed decades ago. The paper crinkled under my touch. Some were barely legible, ink faded to brown, creases splitting along old folds. I spread them across a long wooden table, the kind that wobbles slightly when you lean too hard, and leaned over to study each line. A microfilm scanner hummed nearby, a quiet machine whirring like it knew secrets. I fed in reels labeled lakefront parcels 1840s, 1900s, and watched the glowing screen display surveys that predated the HOA itself by more than a century. My pulse picked up as I scanned through them, lines of ink forming tiny plots, annotations in delicate cursive handwriting, signatures of surveyors long dead. Then I found it, a handwritten shoreline plat dated 1847. The ink had browned, but the words were unmistakable. Parcel boundaries, water access points, riparian rights, clear and precise. My heart thumped as I traced the lines with a finger. This wasn't just a map. This was proof that my ownership of the lake and its immediate shoreline went back over 170 years, far predating any HOA rules or amendments. Historic deeds like this one aren't just ceremonial. They carry legal weight that modern covenants can't override. They define water rights, shoreline access, and private use in ways that HOA bylaws, no matter how cleverly worded, cannot nullify. Even if the HOA claims shared access or community improvements, the law is clear: a property owner with an earlier deed retains primary authority. I photographed the plat, took notes in the margins of my legal pad, and copied relevant portions for safekeeping. Every line felt like leverage. Every annotation felt like a secret waiting to be revealed. I spent hours there scanning microfilm, tracing property corners, comparing old survey points to modern maps. By the time the sun hit high noon, I had a folder full of documents proving one thing: the HOA had no legal authority to dictate dock construction along my portion of the lake. I left the records office with a strange mix of exhaustion and excitement. The neighborhood felt heavier, the conflict looming closer, but now, finally, I had something they couldn't touch. Something that would change everything. Knowledge nugget din 2. Historic water deeds override modern HOA bylaws, even if an HOA creates rules about shared access, docks, or shoreline use. A deed predating those rules generally takes precedence in court. In legal terms, prior ownership and recorded riparian rights establish an enforceable claim, meaning the HOA can't unilaterally impose structures or access on land it doesn't legally control. I tucked the plat into my folder and walked back to my truck. Outside, the sunlight glinted on the lake, just visible through thinning fog. I had the law on my side, but the question remained: how to use it without tipping my hand too early. Mark Caldwell didn't confront me directly. Not yet. He didn't need to. Instead, he started weaving a narrative across the neighborhood like a spider stretching its web over the lake. The first sign was a lakeside barbecue he hosted on a Saturday. A big setup, folding tables, crisp white linens, grills smoking in the late morning sun. Kayaks lined the dock he was already installing on a parcel technically not his. Pontoon boats bobbed nearby. Neighbors came, some curious, some reluctant. He moved among them with a practiced grin, shaking hands, pointing out planned improvements. Boats, a longer dock for community events, kids' paddleboards. Imagine the neighborhood as a destination, he said. Everyone benefits. Some neighbors nodded eagerly, imagining the convenience and prestige. Others glanced around nervously, not sure where to stand. I wasn't invited. Of course I was. During the tour, Mark lingered near the edge of the dock and called out in that booming voice. Of course some landowners have yet to see the benefits. But we're patient. Everyone comes around eventually, right? I could see who he meant. The comment made heads turn subtly toward my property. A few neighbors shifted uncomfortably. One muttered something under their breath. A laugh from the far side of the barbecue. It was public. It was pointed. It was humiliating. Over the next week I noticed subtle pressure campaigns. Flyers slid under doors about petitions for community waterfront improvements. Some envelopes were anonymous. Others bore Mark's signature and a reminder, your vote matters. Neighbors who had avoided confrontation suddenly appeared at my driveway. We'd love to have more access to the lake, they said, hesitating. You wouldn't want to hold the community back, would you? I could see it clearly. He was trying to isolate me. Anyone unsure where to land was nudged subtly toward him. Social pressure, optimism about shared amenities, fear of being labeled a troublemaker, all layered like a trap. He even stopped by during one evening walk, leaned casually against the mailbox, mirrored sunglasses hiding eyes. I know you care about your property, he said, tone oily. But imagine the good this dock will do for everyone. We're just trying to be fair. I didn't argue. I nodded, said nothing. But inside, I counted every move, every comment, every neighbor's hesitation. Mark wasn't just building a dock. He was building consensus around it, and in doing so undermining me before a single hammer hit the water legally. This was the HOA's playbook: social manipulation, subtle intimidation, and turning neighbors into unwilling allies. And yet, as carefully as he thought he had swayed the block, he didn't know one thing. I'd already found the historic deed. Every fake petition, every coaxing smile, every barbecue speech only tightened the threads I was about to pull. The neighborhood thought he was winning, but they were about to see exactly how fragile his empire really was. I waited. Every day I watched the dock stretch further across my lake, the hammering echoing over the water like a drumbeat counting down to a confrontation I didn't yet reveal. But while Mark Caldwell thought he was establishing control, I was preparing mine, quietly, methodically. Every document I had pulled from the county archives, every plat I'd photographed, every annotation in my notebook, it was all part of the plan. The 1847 deed had never left my sight. It was a single sheet of paper, browned with age, edges frayed, written in cursive that bent and curled like reeds in a river current. I traced my fingers over the ink, feeling the centuries between me and the surveyor who first recorded it. This wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a legal weapon, one that completely contradicted everything the HOA was claiming. The deed originated as part of a land grant issued shortly after the state had finalized its first official mapping of the region. Its language was precise. All riparian rights and water access, including the use, control, and improvement of the shoreline contiguous to Parcel 27, are hereby conveyed to the grantee, their heirs and assigns in perpetuity. No community or municipal body shall encroach, modify, or authorize alterations without explicit, written consent of said grantee. Those words were a hammer in themselves. They didn't just protect the land, they explicitly protected me. And unlike modern HOA covenants, which can be challenged or amended, this deed predated them by more than a century. In legal terms, the HOA's rules were subordinate. They could issue notices, post newsletters, and host fancy BBQs, but they could not legally override what was clearly spelled out in black and white. I studied the riparian doctrine, annotations scribbled in the margins. The 1847 surveyor had noted the boundaries in reference to natural markers: the bend in the east tree line, a large oak on the south bank, and the high water mark along the shoreline. Each signature and embossed surveyor stamp added legitimacy. Each stamp reinforced the chain of authority stretching back decades before the HOA even existed. Knowledge Nugget Den 3. Water rights follow a priority system. Riparian landowners who hold historic deeds maintain primary control over access, use, and improvements to waterways. Modern HOA bylaws or community agreements cannot supersede prior recorded rights. Courts consistently uphold the principle that first in time is first in right. That means any dock, pier, or other structure imposed without the landowner's consent is legally unenforceable. I reviewed my folder one last time, then decided it was time to act. I drafted a formal notice to the HOA board, citing the original 1847 grant and referencing state riparian law. The language was meticulous, but firm. The board is hereby notified that any further encroachment or construction along the shoreline of Parcel 27 constitutes a violation of historic water rights as recorded in the 1847 deed, recognized and enforceable under state code. Immediate cessation of all construction activities is demanded. I made sure copies went to the county clerk and the local environmental office. Every step I took established public accountability. This wasn't just about stopping the dock, it was about creating a scenario where the HOA's own aggressive tactics would be exposed. When Mark arrived at the lake that afternoon, hammer in hand, I was waiting, calm, controlled. The sun glinted off my folder as I opened it, revealing the aged plat and stamped survey sheets. His smirk faltered when he saw the embossed seals and the precise cursive, the proof that every move he made was legally null. You can't, he stammered. His usual composure cracked just enough to show the panic behind the polished facade. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I simply pointed to the deed and said, "Every inch of this shoreline, every board you've placed is mine. You've built without consent." The law is clear. Neighbors gathered. Some were curious, some hesitant, but all were now witnesses. The quiet intimidation Mark had relied on was evaporating under the weight of irrefutable proof. By the time I finished explaining the historical precedents, riparian doctrine, and the surveyor stamps, the dock didn't look like a symbol of HOA authority anymore. It was a monument to their arrogance, and I had the deed, the law, and the public watching as my leverage shifted entirely. Mark's power was no longer in the hammer or the speeches or the manipulated neighborhood tours. His power depended on fear and ignorance, and now both had been removed. This was the moment the scales began to tip. Everything he had built physically and socially was about to collapse. The community hall smelled of polished wood and tension. Folding chairs were set in tight rows, packed with neighbors who had clearly heard whispers, rumors, and teaser emails about the dock conflict. A long rectangular table at the front was already crowded with HOA board members, but today Mark Caldwell's usual smug confidence seemed slightly off balance. I arrived with a folder in hand, thick, worn, filled with deeds, plats, and microfilm copies, carefully annotated. I wasn't here to argue emotionally. I was here to prove a fact, and facts cannot be ignored. A sheriff sat near the side door, eyes scanning the room calmly, arms crossed. Beside him, the county clerk and an environmental compliance officer flipped through binders quietly. Their presence wasn't to intimidate me, it was to witness, to validate, and if necessary, enforce. Mark opened the meeting with his usual preamble. "Thank you all for coming," he said, voice booming. "We're here to discuss ongoing community improvements. Some concerns have been raised about shoreline access. I assure you, the board is acting in everyone's best interest." He smiled at me, the kind of smile that usually turned conversations into performances. "I've reviewed the documents provided by the homeowner," he said, glancing at his notes, "but honestly, I don't see how this changes anything. We're improving the community, that's what matters." I stepped forward, folder in hand, letting the weight of it speak before I said a word. Slowly I opened it on the table. Photocopies of the 1847 deed and plats were carefully laid out. I gestured toward them, letting everyone see the stamps, signatures, and handwritten boundary notes. "This," I said calm but firm, "is the original 1847 water rights deed for Parcel 27, the land adjacent to this shoreline. It grants me full riparian rights, including control over any structures or improvements along this portion of the lake. It predates the HOA by over a century. These documents are legally binding. They are recognized under state law." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Mark's smirk faltered, his usual rehearsed tone faltering, as he said, "Well, that may be historic," but I cut him off with measured calm. "Historic, yes, but legally superior. HOA rules, bylaws, newsletters, and petitions cannot override this deed. Every plank you've placed without my consent is a violation of property law." The sheriff leaned forward, eyes on Mark. The county clerk held up one of the photocopies for the room to see. The environmental officer nodded, reviewing the original plat I'd brought. "One of them," the clerk spoke next, slow and deliberate. "According to our records, these documents are valid and fully enforceable. Any unauthorized construction along this parcel constitutes trespass and violation of established water rights. The HOA cannot authorize, approve, or implement improvements here without explicit consent from the landowner." The words landed like a hammer. The room went silent. The neighbors who had smiled politely now stared at Mark in disbelief. The ones who had been quietly siding with him looked down at their hands. Mark's voice shook slightly, just enough to show that his confidence had been punctured. I think there's some misunderstanding." I raised a hand, gesturing toward the deed and plats. No misunderstanding, this is straightforward. Every action taken on my shoreline without my permission is unlawful. I've documented every step, every notification, and every intrusion. The law is clear. You cannot override it, and you cannot enforce it. A board member coughed nervously. One resident whispered, "He's right. He has the documents." Mark's final defense was a shrug, the last trace of smugness crumbling. "Well, we were just trying to help the community." I didn't respond. The silence said more than words could. The sheriff's presence, the clerk's affirmation, the visible deeds, all of it spoke for itself. Neighbors were no longer passive observers. They were witnesses, and the dam of authority Mark had relied on for months had started to crack in real time. By the end of the meeting, the board was forced to acknowledge the documents. Mark sat slumped in his chair, the public and legal scrutiny dismantling the power he'd wielded for so long. The doc he had celebrated, touted, and showcased now hung in the air like a monument to arrogance. I closed the folder carefully, letting the weight of the evidence sink in one last time. Outside, the lake reflected the late afternoon sun. The boards he had hammered into place seemed smaller somehow, insignificant against centuries of legal authority. The room emptied slowly, neighbors whispering and glancing at each other. The sheriff lingered for a moment, nodded at me, and left. The county clerk collected the originals for official review. The environmental officer made notes for follow-up, and as I stepped outside, breathing deeply, I realized it. The power had shifted entirely. The dock might still stand for now, but it no longer represented control. The narrative had flipped. The HOA's empire of intimidation had been exposed, and the law, patience, and preparation had won. This was more than a victory for me. It was a public reckoning, and it was only the beginning. The moment the meeting ended, Mark Caldwell's composure cracked entirely. He didn't storm out, he didn't argue. He huddled at the corner of the room, whispering urgently to a lawyer who had followed him from the board office. The tone was low, clipped, tense, far removed from the booming confidence that had dominated every prior gathering. I watched from across the hall, quietly observing the unraveling. Around us, residents were no longer quiet spectators. Murmurs grew into discussions. Faces that had nodded politely at Mark's BBQs now furrowed in doubt, frustration, and disbelief. Neighbors who had once avoided me now whispered among themselves, "He built it on someone else's land? Did he really think no one would notice? This could cost the HOA everything." The atmosphere shifted. For months, Mark's aura of control had dominated this community. But now, every whispered conversation chipped away at it. People who had feared retaliation now openly questioned the legality of the project. At the next board meeting called urgently after the public confrontation, votes were taken on whether to launch an internal investigation. The motion passed unanimously. Even some of Mark's closest allies abstained rather than support him. Their hesitation spoke volumes. The county sheriff and environmental officer issued a formal construction stop order immediately. Every plank, every piling, every hammer stroke came to an abrupt halt. Mark tried to argue procedural points, waving letters and HOA covenants like shields, but it was futile. The legal weight of the 1847 deed, combined with the public scrutiny, rendered his arguments hollow. Within days, an emergency injunction was filed. The dock was flagged for removal, pending full compliance review. Notices went out to all residents, not just board members. The community now had a formal document confirming what I had proved in that hall. Mark Caldwell had overstepped his authority, and any continued construction constituted unlawful trespass. Mark's reactions were subtle but telling. He arrived at the lake one afternoon, surveying the halted dock. The swagger was gone. His usual glare, his attempts at intimidation, even the rehearsed lines he delivered to neighbors evaporated. He spoke only in hushed tones to the lawyer who followed him like a shadow, pacing and gesturing as if negotiating some impossible escape from the consequences of his own actions. The residents, by contrast, had begun to look at me differently. Those who had once avoided me, who had whispered behind my back, now approached with quiet acknowledgement. "We didn't realize," one said, shaking her head. "I guess we all got swept up in appearances." Another nodded, saying thank you for showing us what was really going on. Mark's collapse wasn't dramatic. There were no shouts or confrontations. It was a slow erosion, public and private, legal and social. The combination of historic deeds, procedural knowledge, and public witness dismantled the carefully constructed facade he had maintained for months. Even the HOA board began restructuring. Policies about docks, shoreline improvements, and community projects were reviewed under legal supervision. Mark's unilateral authority had evaporated. Construction crews packed up, leaving the partially built dock like a monument to hubris. Faded pink survey flags fluttered in the wind, a reminder of how quickly ambition could be undone when it ignores law, rights, and transparency. By the end of this collapse, the lake was quiet again. Boards left partially installed, construction materials gathered, and official notices posted along the shoreline. Mark remained a presence, but he no longer controlled the narrative. The community, once intimidated and divided, had regained clarity. The power had shifted definitively and irrevocably. For the first time in months, I could walk the shoreline without hearing hammers, without seeing survey crews, without feeling the pressure of whispered judgments. The dock that had symbolized oppression now symbolized nothing more than the limits of arrogance against law and preparation. This collapse marked not just a personal victory, but a precedent. Authority imposed through intimidation, without proper legal foundation, could be stopped. Not through force, not through confrontation alone, but through meticulous documentation, patience, and clarity of rights. The neighborhood and the lake had survived the storm, and Mark Caldwell's empire of control lay quietly in ruins, at least for now. The first official notice arrived on a crisp Thursday morning, slipped under my front gate. Its weight wasn't in the envelope, but in the words it carried. Mark Caldwell had been fined, substantial enough to make a statement, yet precise enough to avoid exaggeration. The fine cited the unauthorized construction, the trespass on private riparian property, and violation of historic water rights. Every point referenced the 1847 deed I had unearthed months ago. The community didn't need a newsletter this time. Word traveled quickly. Neighbors who had kept silent out of fear now nodded knowingly at each other in driveways. Some smiled politely when I walked past, a quiet acknowledgement of what had been accomplished. The shift in tone was tangible, almost electric. Mark's fall didn't stop with fines. The HOA board faced internal pressure the moment the county and community recognized the severity of his actions. Members who had previously supported him began calling for a recall vote. It was a rare event, but the evidence was irrefutable. One by one, his allies either abstained or voiced support for his resignation, realizing that continuing to defend him would only prolong public scrutiny. Legal costs were next. The HOA was ordered to reimburse the expenses I had incurred, documenting, verifying, and defending my property rights. Surveyors, attorneys, microfilm rentals, and consultations, all accounted for. The reimbursement wasn't just a financial relief, it was symbolic. It signified accountability. It demonstrated that communities and boards cannot act recklessly without consequences. And the dock, it became the most visible symbol of accountability. Work halted, partially constructed piles left standing like silent monuments, and an official dismantling order ensured that no part of it could legally remain in the water until full compliance and consent were obtained. The structure that had once represented arrogance and control now became a cautionary tale, visible to anyone walking along the shoreline. The ethical implications reached further. An ethics investigation into Mark's conduct was opened. Public testimony, HOA records, and community statements became part of an ongoing review. It was a slow process, but the message was clear. Misuse of authority and intimidation in governance, even in private neighborhood organizations, would be scrutinized. By the time the first formal proceedings concluded, Mark's influence was no longer absolute. The combination of fines, public exposure, and the looming ethics review had stripped him of the fear-based control he had relied upon. The recall vote was scheduled on a warm Saturday morning, the kind of day when the lake reflected sunlight like a mirror. Community members arrived early, folding chairs set along the shoreline to accommodate observers. It wasn't festive, it was serious, a rare convergence of governance, legality, and civic responsibility. When Mark arrived, the difference was immediately obvious. Gone was the booming voice, the polished smile, the casual authority. He moved quietly, whispering to a handful of loyal supporters, checking documents, and gesturing nervously. The community, once intimidated, now felt emboldened. Votes were cast. Residents who had feared repercussions now expressed opinions openly, citing the public confrontation, the legal documentation, and the ethics violations. As ballots were tallied, the results were undeniable. Mark Caldwell was forced to resign from the HOA presidency immediately. His recall wasn't just procedural, it was a public statement of community accountability. The dock, which had loomed over the water for months, was formally marked for dismantling. Environmental officers supervised its removal, ensuring compliance with both historic deed rights and modern environmental standards. Every removed board and piling was logged and returned, a meticulous undoing of what had been done without authority. Financial relief followed. The HOA reimbursed legal fees, covering all costs related to document acquisition, attorney consultation, and survey verification. Beyond the money, this reimbursement symbolized a reversal of the intimidation tactic. I was no longer paying the price for their misjudgment. Meanwhile, the ethics investigation proceeded slowly but deliberately. Mark's actions, misrepresentation, construction without consent, and public coercion were formally reviewed. He faced permanent censure and restrictions from future board participation, a long-term accountability measure that ensured he couldn't repeat the same abuses. By the end of these proceedings, the neighborhood had regained stability. The shoreline was once again secure under my ownership. Neighbors who had been silent or cautious became more engaged, attending community meetings and asking questions about future projects. Transparency replaced fear. Standing on the water's edge, I watched the last pile of dismantled dock boards being loaded onto a truck. The lake was calm. Birds flitted across the reeds. The sun cast a warm glow over the water. Justice had been served, not through aggression, but through preparation, persistence, and the careful application of law. I had protected more than my property. I had restored trust, reaffirmed rights, and ensured that the lake, my lake, remained a place of order, respect, and peace. After the dust settled, the neighborhood began a slow but noticeable transformation. The toxic grip of Mark Caldwell was gone, and with it came an opportunity for the community to rebuild on a foundation of transparency and accountability. The first visible change came with the new HOA board election. Members were voted in not for charisma, social influence, or bravado, but for integrity, experience, and willingness to respect property rights. Campaign promises centered on openness, communication, and legal compliance. For the first time in years, I attended a meeting without the weight of fear pressing on me. Chairs were arranged in a circle rather than the hierarchical rectangle Mark had favored. The energy in the room was different. Collaborative, curious, and cautiously optimistic. Financial transparency followed quickly. Budgets were no longer guarded secrets. Transparent budgeting meetings allowed residents to see exactly how HOA dues were spent, including administrative costs, maintenance, and improvement projects. Questions were welcomed, documents shared openly, and approval processes clearly documented. Neighbors could finally participate without fearing retaliation, and the sense of collective ownership replaced the previous climate of coercion. Property surveys were commissioned along the entire lakeshore, not as a tool for intimidation, but as a proactive measure to ensure that every boundary and water right issue was clarified. Independent surveyors verified ownership lines, riparian rights, and easements, providing a neutral, professional perspective. Maps were distributed to all residents, giving everyone clarity and preventing future misunderstandings. The same microfilm scans, plats, and deeds I had relied on during my investigation were now part of a shared community archive, accessible to anyone who wanted to verify claims. With clarity came reconciliation. Some neighbors who had been hesitant, fearful, or misled approached me quietly. Apologies were whispered in driveways or at the edge of the lake. "I didn't realize what was really happening," one neighbor said, eyes downcast. "I'm sorry we didn't support you sooner," murmured another, offering a handshake. It wasn't performative, it was acknowledgement, small, personal, human acts that marked the end of months of fear and suspicion. Gradually, trust rebuilt itself, stitch by stitch, conversation by conversation. The dock that had sparked months of conflict was dismantled, but the lake itself thrived. Wildlife returned to the shoreline I had nurtured. Fishermen, kayakers, and families respected the boundaries established by the historic deed, but they also benefited from a more engaged, cooperative community. Shared spaces were managed responsibly, without overreach or intimidation, and the water remained a sanctuary rather than a battleground. Standing on the shore one early morning, fog lifting from the water, I reflected on the months of tension and struggle. The power I had wielded was not brute force, it was knowledge, preparation, and patience. The HOA's collapse and the subsequent transformation proved that communities could correct themselves when fairness, law, and transparency guided action. The lessons extended beyond my own parcel. Neighbors began attending meetings regularly, asking questions about projects, and participating in decision-making processes. The board instituted regular audits and community forums. The culture of fear and whispered threats was replaced with collaboration and mutual respect. Most importantly, the lake itself became a symbol, a reminder that accountability and vigilance can protect what we value most. What had started as a personal fight to protect my shoreline had evolved into a community-wide revival. Property rights were respected, authority was held in check, and trust, once fractured, began to heal. In the quiet of the morning, I could finally hear only the birds and the gentle ripple of water against the reclaimed shoreline. The neighborhood had survived its ordeal, stronger and wiser than before, and I had helped guide that change without sacrificing the principles that had motivated me from the start. Justice was no longer just about penalties or fines, it was about restoring order, fairness, and the shared responsibility of a community. And for the first time in a long time, walking along the lake felt like walking into a future defined not by fear, but by law, transparency, and mutual respect. I returned to the shoreline alone that evening, the sun sinking low, painting the water in streaks of gold and amber. The air smelled of wet wood and pine, and the gentle lapping of the waves against the shore was a quiet reward after months of noise, conflict, and tension. The dismantled dock stood partially disassembled, pier posts lifted and stacked nearby, their rough surfaces warm under my fingertips. I ran my hand over one, feeling the grain and the evidence of countless hammer strikes, each one a reminder of what had almost been taken from me. For a long moment, I let myself imagine grabbing a hammer and retaliating, letting rage dictate action. But I didn't. Patience had been my true weapon. Restraint, preparation, and quiet persistence had won where anger would have failed. Every late-night microfilm session, every visit to dusty county drawers, every meticulous note and photograph had mattered more than the impulse to confront him physically or emotionally. I sank to the edge of the water, watching the sun melt behind distant trees. Pride welled quietly, not arrogance, not triumph over another, but the knowledge that I had protected something precious without sacrificing integrity. The lake, calm and restored, reflected more than the sunset. It reflected years of careful stewardship, the strength it takes to stand firm against pressure, and the clarity that patience and knowledge bring. I breathed deeply, letting the warmth of the fading day settle over me, feeling the long months of struggle dissolve into stillness. The shoreline was mine again, the community healed, and the lesson clear: power tempered with patience is stronger than force. I rose, brushed sand from my hands, and watched the last light fade, grateful that justice had arrived quietly, fully, and with dignity intact. I turned to the camera, letting the lake fill the frame behind me. "Have you ever dealt with an HOA nightmare?" I asked, voice calm but firm. Share your story in the comments. Speak up, protect your property, and don't let intimidation go unchecked. As I stepped back, the camera began to pull wide, revealing the full expanse of the lake. The water glinted in the late golden hour, calm and undisturbed. The dismantled dock lay quietly on the shore, a reminder of consequences met and justice served. Birds settled into the reeds along the shoreline, wings folding as they prepared for the evening. The gentle ripple of water carried a soft, rhythmic pulse, nature reclaiming the space from human conflict. The neighborhood, once fractured by fear and coercion, now breathed in quiet harmony. Trees swayed gently, sunlight reflecting off ripples and casting dancing shadows on the water. Peace had returned, not just to the lake but to the community that called it home. The frame held, wide and cinematic, the shoreline stretching into the distance. I stood silently, letting the calm speak louder than any words. A final visual testament: patience, preparation, and persistence had restored not only my property but the balance of the community,